very early in development, and so instead of having one uh, uh, one individual organism, you now have two. But it originally came from one zygote. So one sperm cell uh, became implanted in one egg cell, and that became the zygote. That zygote then split and formed two completely independent organisms. Now, of course, sometimes that zygote doesn't split completely, and this results in conjoined twins, or sometimes called Siamese twins. They have the same genotype, but slight variations in phenotype are possible, once again, due to environmental influences. Okay, and that would be an individual's phenotype. So their genotype might be the exact same, but their phenotype might be a little bit different because of the interaction of their genes with the environment. Dizygotic, sometimes called fraternal twins, these result from the fertilization of two separate ova by two separate sperm cells. Okay, so again, that's different from the monozygotic or identical twins because that was just one sperm cell fertilizing one egg cell. Now, in the case of dizygotic twins, we've got two egg cells, two separate egg cells containing different sets of DNA being fertilized by two different sperm cells, each containing different DNA as well. Dizygotic twins have half their genes in common and occur about twice as often as monozygotic twins. It's important to also mention that this half genes shared in common, that's really just on average that they share half their genes in common. Because remember that mom is passing on half of her genes. So which half is it going to be? It's pretty much a random half. So next time she passes on a random half, there's going to be some overlap. Okay? You can think about this like a deck of cards. Okay? If you were to shuffle a deck of cards and deal out half the deck, so 52 cards in a deck of cards, you deal out half of those, 26 come out the first time. Now you put those 26 cards back in the deck, shuffle it up really well, and deal out 26 cards again, and which 26 cards are going to get dealt out the second time? Well, about half of them are going to be cards that were dealt out the first time, and about half of them will be cards that were dealt out the second time, that were not dealt out the first time. So there'll be new cards. So on average, we say that they'll share about 50%, because half of them would have been passed out the first time, half of them would not have been. Now, the incidence seems to be under genetic influences and varies by both ethnicity and age. So humans, they usually possess 46 chromosomes. That's what's supposed to happen. That's what's considered to be the normal case. 44 of these chromosomes are called autosomes because they're the same whether you're a male or a female, and 2 of them are sex chromosomes. So again, 44 and 2, that's 46 total. These 2 sex chromosomes will be different for males than they are for females. For females, they call them 2 X's in the 23rd pair. So that would be in the 23rd pair, that would be number 45 and number 46. Males have an X and a Y. The Y is actually just a smaller chromosome. It looks more like a Y because it's actually missing a part of DNA. So the sex of the offspring depends on whether the father's Y sperm or X sperm fertilizes the ovum. In other words, it's always the male that determines the sex of the offspring because males have XY. They can pass on either the X or the Y. Females only have XX. So no matter what, they're going to pass on one of the X's. 2 X's makes a female, an X and a Y makes a male. Okay. So most genes are called polygenic. Okay, that means, or most traits rather, are called polygenic, which means that they're affected by many genes. They're also multifactorial, which means that they're influenced by many factors. So, how tall you're going to be, for instance, that's a polygenic trait because it's not just one gene that determines how tall you are, it's multiple genes. It's also multifactorial because it's not just your genes that determine how tall you're going to be, it's also influenced by environmental factors. So, for instance, you remember that milk commercial where, if you drink lots of milk, you'll grow nice and tall, and if you don't drink any milk, you won't grow very tall. Well, that's an illustration of the influence of your environment. That if you've got genes that predispose you to become very tall, but you're malnourished, that's going to influence your height. You're not going to grow as tall as you would have had you not been malnourished. We also have regulator genes. These genes direct the interactions of other genes, controlling their genetic expression, duplication, and transcription. They're responsible for differences between species. Additive genes are genes that add something to some aspect of the phenotype. The effects of additive genes add up to make the phenotype. So, for example, height is affected by the contributions of about 100 genes. And so what that means is that, the first 50 are influencing how tall you're going to be. And then those next 50 are going to continue to influence how tall you're going to be. That's how most genes or most traits are determined by these additive genes. Okay? It's not so basic that just one gene determines anything. Usually it's a result of the additive contribution of genes. Dominant recessive heredity. Dominant genes, these are far more influential than recessive genes. They're non-additive, meaning that when you've got a dominant gene and a recessive gene, it's the dominant gene that expresses itself. Okay, that doesn't mean that a dominant gene is strong and a recessive gene is weak. It's simply determined by whether it expresses itself or not. If a gene expresses itself in the presence of another gene, it's considered to be dominant. Remember, in the presence of another gene, meaning that if you get one from your mother and one from your father, the one that you got from your mother, if it shows up, it's considered to be a dominant if it shows up in your phenotype. Dominant genes can completely control the phenotype with no noticeable effect of recessive genes. One example of this are genes for blood type B and Rh positive blood. So if your mother has blood type B positive, that means that you are going to have B positive blood, okay? Because no matter what blood type your father has, who passes on to you, your phenotype will be B positive. That doesn't mean that you can't have a gene for type O blood or for Rh negative blood, but that won't express itself. You'll have the genes, that's your genotype, but it won't be expressed. In other words, it won't show up in your phenotype. So the effect of recessive genes, it can sometimes be noticed. Dominant brown eye gene and recessive blue eye genes can sometimes result in hazel eyes. So if you know somebody who has hazel eyes, chances are that one of the parents had blue eyes, the other parent had non-blue eyes or brown eyes, and that's what resulted in hazel eyes. This also means the fact that there can be a discrepancy between genotype and phenotype means that a person can also be a carrier. This is a person whose genotype includes a gene that is not expressed in the phenotype. Unexpressed genes occur in half of the carrier's gametes and is passed on to half of the carrier's offspring. Offspring can be a carrier or express the gene in the phenotype. when it's unexpressed, or when for example, when the unexpressed gene is inherited by both parents. Eye color is a very common example here because the gene that codes for blue eyes is recessive, and the gene that codes for brown eyes is dominant. So, for instance, I have hazel eyes. My father has brown eyes, my mother has blue eyes. Okay, my mother, since she has blue eyes, we know that she has to have two genes for blue eyes, because otherwise she wouldn't be showing blue eyes. Now, my father, he must have one dominant gene for brown eyes that he got from one of his parents, and one recessive gene for blue eyes that he got from his other parent, or from my grandparent. And that means that I'm a carrier of the blue-eyed gene. Now, my brother, he's got blue eyes. What that means is that he got, of course, one recessive blue-eyed gene from my mother, and he must have gotten the recessive gene for blue eyes from my father. So I'm a carrier, but I'm not expressing blue eyes. My brother, his phenotype is blue eyes, and he is expressing it. Even though we both contain a gene for blue eyes, he is expressing it, I am not, because I also have a dominant gene for brown eyes. Now, again, typically it's not the case that genes determine anything. Blue eyes is a common example because it's one of the few traits that is under the control of just a few genes. Now, when we try to identify the extent to which genes contribute to different traits, behavioral or physical, we typically come across a term called heritability. This is a statistical term that indicates what portion of the variation in a particular trait within a particular population is inherited. For example, 90% of the height differences among children of the same age is genetic. The environment can affect the expression of inherited genes. Okay, this is really a very commonly misinterpreted term, heritability. Okay, let me go over the definition one more time. It indicates what portion of the variation in a particular trait in a particular population is inherited. Okay, there's a few other ways I could state this, but what it's basically telling us is that some of the variability that we see between people, let's say in their height, some of the variability between people in height can be explained by genes, and some of it can be explained by the environment. How much of the variability in height difference in, say, our class can be explained by genes, genetic differences? About 90%. That means that about 10% of the variability in the height of, say, our class can be explained by differences in their environment. Now, here's an important thing to remember here, is that just because 90% of height differences among children can be explained by differences in genes does not mean necessarily that 90% of your height is determined by genes. Okay? This is telling you that 90% of the variability among people is due to genes. Okay? Not 90% of what height you are is determined by genes. So that's something that's very important to keep in mind, is that this does a good job of explaining genetic differences among a group of people or a population, but it doesn't do the same thing in terms of telling us about an individual. Okay, I've pasted 3 tables that look at genetic problems, genetic disorders, some of the more common ones. This is table 2.1 here, 2.2, and 2.3 in the text, and this is just a slide to remind you to take a look at those tables. Okay, so we've talked about the formation